A maid is caught crying while holding a millionaire's baby. But the reason behind her tears will break your heart. This isn't just a story about wealth and poverty. It's about a love so powerful it refuses to die, even after tragedy. Stay with me, because once you hear her secret, you'll never look at her the same way again. Welcome to BrainFuel, where we share the most powerful and emotional real-life inspired stories, tales of pain, hope, and the strength of the human heart. If you love stories that touch your soul and remind you of the beauty of compassion, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and join our family. Together, let's spread stories that inspire millions. The first sound that filled the nursery wasn't laughter, nor the cheerful voice of a doting mother. It was silence, the kind of silence that seems to echo louder than noise. Then, gently breaking that stillness, came the faint coo of a newborn baby, a sound so pure, so innocent, that it had the power to soften even the hardest of hearts. In the center of that grand nursery, standing beneath a golden chandelier and surrounded by walls painted in the softest cream, was a woman who seemed out of place. She wasn't dressed in silk gowns or adorned with sparkling jewelry. Instead, she wore a simple navy blue maid's uniform, slightly faded at the edges from years of use. Her hands, roughened by work, trembled as they cradled the small bundle in her arms. Her name was Grace. To anyone passing by, she might have looked like nothing more than a caretaker performing her duty. But if they looked closer, they would have noticed something unusual. Tears. Silent, unstoppable tears rolled down her dark cheeks, falling like rain onto the baby's white blanket. Her lips quivered, as though whispering words she could not bring herself to speak aloud. Grace tried to steady her breathing, hoping none of the other staff would walk in and see her in this state. She had always been known as reliable, professional, and composed. But here she was, holding the child of a millionaire, breaking apart as if her own soul had cracked wide open. Why was she crying? It wasn't because the baby was difficult. He wasn't. In fact, he was one of the calmest babies she had ever cared for. It wasn't because the job was too demanding. Grace had worked in harder conditions before. And it certainly wasn't because she disliked the child. In truth, the opposite was true. The moment she laid eyes on him, something inside her stirred, something she thought she had buried years ago. The child's tiny fingers clutched at her uniform, squeezing as if he somehow sensed she needed comfort. His small eyes blinked up at her, curious and trusting, oblivious to the storm of grief and memory raging in her heart. And that was the moment Grace broke. Her chest heaved as a sob escaped her lips. She pulled the baby closer, as though hugging him could fill the emptiness that had lived inside her for so long. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, though the words were not meant for him. They were meant for someone else, someone she had lost. The nursery itself seemed to mock her pain. Everything about the room screamed wealth and privilege. A soft Persian carpet covered the floor. A rocking chair carved from expensive mahogany stood beside the crib. Toys made of fine wood and even silver rattles lined the shelves, waiting for the child to grow old enough to use them. No expense had been spared. This baby would never know hunger, never know the fear of being abandoned, never be denied medical care because of a lack of money. And that truth cut Grace deeper than any knife, because once upon a time, she too had held a baby in her arms, a baby she loved with every fiber of her being, a baby she had promised to protect. But unlike this millionaire's child, her own little boy had not been surrounded by safety, wealth, or comfort. Her child had been surrounded by struggle, by poverty, by pain. Grace's tears flowed harder. She rocked the baby gently, her voice trembling as she hummed an old lullaby. It was a song her grandmother used to sing, a tune that carried memories of home, warmth, and love. But now, each note carried with a weight of sorrow, a reminder of what she had lost. At that moment, the door creaked open ever so slightly. One of the mansion's butlers, a stern-looking man in his 50s, paused in the doorway. His brows furrowed as he noticed Grace's tear-streaked face. But he said nothing. He simply assumed she was overwhelmed with the responsibilities of caring for such an important child. With a slight shake of his head, he moved on, closing the door behind him. Grace exhaled, relieved that she hadn't been questioned. She wiped her face quickly, but fresh tears followed immediately. She couldn't stop them. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't stress. It was grief, grief that had been locked away for years, now spilling out because of the child in her arms. The irony was unbearable. She was standing in a mansion so large it could house 50 families, holding a baby who would never want for anything. And yet, she, his caretaker, had once lost her own baby simply because she had nothing. That cruel reality clawed at her soul. The baby cooed again, resting his tiny head against her chest. That small act of trust, so innocent, so unknowing, shattered what little strength Grace had left. She kissed his forehead softly, whispering, "I promise you'll never suffer the way he did." Though she knew the child belonged to another family, Grace silently vowed to protect him as if he were her own. She would give him every ounce of love she had left inside, even if it tore open old wounds. And so she stood there, rocking the millionaire's baby beneath the golden chandelier, her tears falling freely. To the world, it was a simple image of a maid caring for her employer's child. But for Grace, it was something much more. It was a reminder of love lost. It was a wound that had never healed. And it was the beginning of a story no one in that mansion could have ever imagined. Before Grace ever stepped foot into Grand William's mansion, before she ever held another woman's child in her arms, she had once known the joy and the unbearable pain of motherhood herself. Her life had not always been uniforms and service. Long before she became the maid, she was simply a mother, and her entire world had been wrapped in the small, fragile body of a little boy named Daniel. Daniel had been born on a stormy night, in a tiny wooden shack on the outskirts of the city. Grace remembered the rain pounding on the tin roof as she held her newborn for the very first time. Though she had nothing, not money, not comfort, not even a proper crib, she had love. And in that moment, love felt like it was enough. Daniel's eyes had been bright from the start, wide with curiosity as though he had come into this world eager to explore every corner of it. Grace would rock him to sleep by candlelight, humming lullabies her own mother once sang to her. Their home may have been small, with cracks in the walls and floors that creaked under the weight of poverty, but to Grace, it was filled with light. That light was Daniel. Every morning, she would rise before the sun to fetch water, prepare what little food she could afford, and then head out to whatever work she could find. Some days, she cleaned clothes by the river for wealthier families. Other days, she scrubbed floors or sold fruit in the marketplace. The money was never enough, but every coin went toward Daniel's needs. She would rather go hungry than see her child without food. Despite the struggles, Daniel was a happy child. He laughed easily, finding joy in the smallest of things, a butterfly fluttering by, the sound of rain, or even the shadow puppets Grace made on their wall at night. Neighbors would often comment on his smile, saying it was like sunshine breaking through the darkest storm. And Grace believed it. He was her sunshine. But poverty has a cruel way of stealing joy. When Daniel was just 5 years old, he fell ill. At first, it was only a cough, a slight fever. Grace told herself it was nothing serious, that children got sick all the time. She tried simple remedies, herbal teas, warm blankets, whispered prayers into the night. But within days, the fever worsened. His small body burned with heat, his breathing grew shallow, and his once bright eyes became dull with exhaustion. Grace's heart pounded with terror. She knew this was more than a simple sickness. She knew her son needed a doctor. With trembling hands, she carried him through the streets to the nearest hospital, her tears mixing with sweat as she ran. But when she arrived, the nightmare began. The nurse at the counter, dressed in a crisp white uniform, barely looked up when Grace pleaded for help. "You'll need to make a deposit first," she said flatly, sliding a form across the desk. Grace blinked in disbelief. "Please, my son. He can't breathe properly. Please, just look at him." But the nurse shook her head. "I'm sorry. Hospital policy. We cannot admit him without payment." Grace felt her knees weaken. She didn't have savings. Every coin she earned went straight to food, rent, and clothing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the few bills she had, crumpled and damp from her desperate grip. It wasn't enough. "I will pay. I'll work for free. I'll clean every floor in this hospital. I'll do anything," she begged. her voice breaking. But the nurse only repeated the same cold words. No deposit, no treatment. Grace fell to her knees right there in the waiting room, clutching Daniel's frail body. She cried out to strangers, begging anyone for help. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others shook their heads, whispering to themselves about how tragic it was. But no one stepped forward. Minutes turned to hours. Daniel's breathing grew weaker, his tiny chest rising and falling like a flickering flame about to go out. Grace kissed his forehead again and again, whispering, "Stay with me, baby. Please stay with me." But love, as powerful as it was, could not fight the sickness alone. In the cold corner of that hospital waiting room, before a doctor ever laid eyes on him, Daniel's little body went still. His chest stopped rising. His eyes closed one last time, and his sunshine was gone. Grace let out a scream that echoed to the halls, a sound so raw, so piercing, that even the hardest hearts in that building paused. She rocked her son in her arms, wailing, begging him to wake up. But there was no miracle, no second chance. Poverty had taken from her the most precious gift she had ever been given. From that day on, Grace was never the same. She buried Daniel in a small cemetery on the edge of town, placing flowers she could barely afford on his grave. Every morning, she visited, whispering apologies. "I'm sorry, my baby. I should have saved you. I should have found a way." She carried that guilt like a shadow, following her everywhere she went. And as the years passed, she forced herself to survive. She worked harder, took whatever jobs came her way, and built walls around her heart so no one could see the pain inside. But no matter how many walls she built, there was one thing she could never escape: the memory of holding her dying child, powerless to save him. So when Grace stood years later in the Williams mansion, holding the millionaire's baby, all of those memories came flooding back. The baby's soft skin, his innocent eyes, the way he wrapped his little fingers around hers. It was Daniel all over again, and that was why her tears fell so heavily. To the wealthy family, she was just a maid, but inside, she was a grieving mother, haunted by the past, mourning a boy whose laughter once filled her world. The days in the Williams mansion were long, filled with the constant hum of activity. Servants polished marble floors until they gleamed like mirrors. Chefs prepared gourmet meals in the kitchen, and drivers came and went with luxury cars. The house seemed alive with wealth, a place where nothing was ever lacking. But for Grace, the only part of the house that mattered was the nursery. It was her assigned duty, her little world inside the enormous mansion. And within that world lived a child who was both her greatest comfort and her greatest torment. Every morning, Grace would tiptoe into the nursery, where sunlight streamed through tall windows dressed with velvet curtains. She would find the baby awake, his small hands reaching upward as if trying to catch the rays of light. His eyes, round, curious, innocent, would meet hers. And in that instant, Grace felt her chest tighten. For in his gaze, she saw not just a child, but a reflection of her own lost son. At first, she tried to steel herself. She reminded herself again and again, this is not Daniel. This is not your baby. This child belongs to another family. You are just here to do your job. She told herself that distance would protect her heart, that she could care for the child without letting her soul get involved. But then came the smile. It happened one afternoon while Grace rocked the baby gently in her arms. She had just finished feeding him, and he lay against her shoulder, cooing softly. She tapped his back rhythmically, waiting for the tiny burp that would follow. Then, as she shifted him slightly to look at his face, he opened his eyes wide, looked right at her, and, without warning, smiled. It was not just any smile. It was a kind of smile that seemed to light up the room, the kind that carried warmth and innocence so pure it made her breath catch. It was Daniel's smile. Her heart stopped for a moment, her arms tightening around the baby as if afraid he might vanish. Memories flooded her mind. The way Daniel used to grin when she made funny faces, the way his little teeth showed when he laughed, the way his entire face lit up at the sight of her. That same joy, that same spark, was now shining from this millionaire's child. Grace's lips trembled as tears welled in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but it was useless. One rolled down her cheek, then another, until they fell onto the baby's soft blanket. She whispered, barely able to speak, "My Daniel, is that you?" The baby reached out, his tiny hand brushing against her chin as though answering her. And in that tender moment, Grace broke. Her tears came in waves, her body trembling as she clutched the child close. She wasn't just holding the Williams baby. She was holding the ghost of her son. She pressed her cheek to his, inhaling the sweet scent of baby powder, and for a fleeting moment, it was as if Daniel had returned to her. But reality was cruel. This was not her boy. This was someone else's child, born into privilege and safety, destined to live a life free of the suffering that had stolen Daniel from her. And that truth made the smile even more painful. As she wept quietly, Grace didn't realize that she was no longer alone. Standing at the doorway, hidden just enough not to disturb, was Mrs. Williams, the baby's mother. At first, Mrs. Williams froze. Her brows furrowed in confusion as she watched the maid, the woman she had hired to care for her child, sobbing while holding him. To her wealthy eyes, it looked almost inappropriate, almost unprofessional. But then, as she looked closer, she saw the depth of emotion etched into Grace's face. These weren't the tears of exhaustion. They weren't the tears of a woman overwhelmed by simple work. They were deeper, raw, broken, human. Mrs. Williams didn't step inside. She simply lingered, torn between interrupting and allowing the moment to unfold. And though she said nothing, she began to wonder, why is she crying like that? What pain is she carrying? Back in the nursery, Grace's tears slowed, but her heart continued to ache. She placed the baby gently into his crib, brushing his forehead with her lips. He gurgled happily, his smile never fading, as if unaware of the storm his innocence had unleashed. Grace sank into the rocking chair, her hands covering her face. She tried to compose herself, whispering again and again, "It's not him. It's not Daniel. Control yourself." But no matter how hard she tried, the truth remained. The baby's smile had unlocked a door in her heart she had kept shut for years. From that day forward, she found herself torn between duty and emotion. Every time the baby smiled at her, she wanted to cry and laugh all at once. Every time he wrapped his tiny hand around her finger, she felt both joy and agony. She began to look forward to his little milestones, the way he cooed, the way he tried to crawl, the way his laughter filled the air. But each of those moments carried a shadow, reminding her of the son, who would never grow to experience them. She became more protective than ever, hovering close, checking his breathing at night, making sure he was never left alone. The staff began to whisper that Grace seemed overly attached, but no one dared confront her. To them, she was simply doing her job well. But to Grace, she wasn't just a maid. She was a mother again, even if only in her heart. And though she tried to hide it, the cracks were showing. Anyone who looked closely could see the tears in her eyes when the baby smiled, or the way she lingered just a little too long while rocking him to sleep. It was only a matter of time before the truth of her past would come spilling out. That evening, the mansion was unusually quiet. Dinner had been served in the great dining hall. The staff had cleared the silver dishes, and the sound of clinking glasses had faded into silence. Mr. Williams had retired to his study with a cigar, while the rest of the house seemed to settle into the calm rhythm of night. But for Mrs. Williams, there was no calm. Her mind kept replaying the image she had witnessed earlier, the maid Grace, holding her baby and crying as though her soul were breaking apart. It hadn't been a simple cry. It had been a cry filled with history, with pain, with secrets too heavy to carry alone. The kind of cry that told a story. Mrs. Williams had tried to brush aside at first. After all, it was not unusual for nannies or maids to form attachments to children they cared for. But something about Grace's tears felt different. They were too raw, too real. There was a wound behind them, one that money or comfort couldn't explain. She found herself pacing the long hallway outside the nursery, the soft glow of golden lamps lighting her path. She hesitated at the door, listening to the faint creak of the rocking chair inside. Grace was humming a lullaby, her voice gentle but trembling, as if she were holding back tears even now. Mrs. Williams took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and stepped inside. Grace startled slightly. rising to her feet, her hands instinctively adjusting her uniform. "Madam, forgive me. I was just putting the baby to sleep." Mrs. Williams nodded, her eyes softening as she glanced at her son peacefully resting in his crib. But her focus quickly returned to Grace. "Grace," she began, her voice calm but firm, "earlier today, I saw you. You were crying while holding my baby." Grace froze. Her throat tightened, her palms dampened. She lowered her gaze, shame flooding her cheeks. I'm sorry, madam. It won't happen again. I let my emotions get the better of me. Please forgive me." But Mrs. Williams didn't look angry. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "I don't want apologies. I want the truth. Why were you crying like that?" Grace's chest rose and fell as she fought to contain the storm within her. For years, she had locked this story away, buried it beneath layers of silence. Speaking it aloud felt like reopening a wound she had barely managed to stitch shut. But there was something in Mrs. Williams' tone, something gentle, something human, that broke through her defenses. Her lips trembled. She clutched the edge of the crib for support. And then, with tears welling once more, she whispered, "Because your baby reminds me of mine." Mrs. Williams tilted her head, confused. "Yours?" Grace nodded slowly, her body shaking as the memories surged. "I had a son once. His name was Daniel. He was my whole world. But I lost him. I lost him because I was poor and because no one would help me." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Grace's uneven breathing. She sank into the rocking chair, her voice breaking as she began to tell the story she had kept hidden for so long. She spoke of the tiny shack where she had raised Daniel, of the nights she stayed awake just to watch him breathe, afraid that the world might take him away. She spoke of his laughter, his sunshine smile, the way he called her mama with such pure joy. Her words painted a picture so vivid that even Mrs. Williams felt as though she could see the little boy before her. And then Grace told her about the sickness, the fever, the hospital, the cruel nurse who had demanded money before help, the way she had begged, fallen to her knees, offered to scrub every floor in the building, only to be ignored. Her voice cracked as she described Daniel's final moments, how his tiny body had grown weaker in her arms, how his breathing had slowed, how she had pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering, "Stay with me," until his chest stopped rising. By the time she finished, Grace's face was wet with tears. Her hands trembled as she covered her eyes, ashamed to have exposed her deepest wound. "I couldn't save him," she whispered. "I failed him. And every time I hold your baby, every time he smiles at me, it feels like my Daniel is back. But then I remember he's gone, and I break all over again." Mrs. Williams stood frozen, her own eyes brimming with tears. She had lived a life of privilege, shielded from the harsh cruelties of poverty. She had never once been told no because of money. Hearing Grace's story shook her to her core. She knelt beside the rocking chair, reaching for Grace's trembling hands. "Grace," she said softly, "you didn't fail your son. The world failed you. The system failed you. No mother should ever have to beg for her child's life." Grace shook her head, still consumed by guilt. "But he died in my arms. How can I ever forgive myself?" Mrs. Williams tightened her grip, her voice firm but compassionate. "Listen to me. You gave your son love. You gave him warmth, laughter, and care. That is not failure. That is motherhood. And the love you lost, you are giving it again here to my baby. That does not make you weak. That makes you extraordinary." Grace looked up, her eyes searching Mrs. Williams' face for any trace of pity. But she found none. Instead, she saw sincerity, empathy, and something she had not felt in years: respect. For the first time since Daniel's death, Grace felt the heavy chains of silence loosen around her heart. Someone had heard her story, not with judgment, but with compassion. In that quiet nursery, under the glow of a single lamp, two women from different worlds sat together. One rich, one poor. One with a living child, one with a buried child. And yet, in that moment, they were equals, bound by the shared language of motherhood, of love, and of loss. Mrs. Williams wiped her own tears and whispered, "From now on, You are not just my employee. You are family. My son is lucky to have you, and I am honored to know the woman who loves so fiercely, even through heartbreak." Grace broke down again, but this time her tears were different. They were not just tears of grief. They were tears of relief, of being seen, of finally sharing the weight she had carried alone for so long. And as the baby stirred in his crib, letting out a soft laugh in his sleep, both women turned toward him. His smile, though unknowing, seemed to bless the bond that had just been formed in that nursery. The bond of truth, healing, and shared humanity. From the night Grace revealed her story, everything inside the Williams mansion began to shift. Before, Grace had been invisible. She was a quiet maid in the background, the one who swept floors, folded clothes, and carried the baby without anyone really seeing her. But after that night, Mrs. Williams couldn't look at her the same way. She no longer saw just a maid. She saw a grieving mother who carried a love so deep that it could cross even the boundaries of life and death. The very next morning, Mrs. Williams walked into the nursery, not as an employer checking on her staff, but as a woman reaching out to another. She found Grace singing softly to the baby, her voice trembling yet tender. The baby's eyes sparkled with joy, his chubby hands reaching toward Grace, as if she were his whole world. Mrs. Williams watched for a moment, her heart swelling. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "He loves you, Grace. He truly does." Grace froze, unsure how to respond. In most wealthy households, it was dangerous for a maid to grow too close to the child of the family. Attachments were often frowned upon, boundaries drawn with sharp lines. But Mrs. Williams didn't just allow it. She encouraged it. "You are not only caring for him," she continued. "You are giving him something priceless, love. A kind of love no money can buy." Grace's eyes filled with tears. For years, she had been told she was just a maid, nothing more. But here was a wealthy woman acknowledging her heart, her role, her worth. For the first time in so long, Grace didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. Over the weeks that followed, the bond between Grace and the baby grew stronger. Whenever he cried, it was Grace's arms he reached for first. When he giggled, it was often at her silly faces and gentle tickles. And when he needed comfort, it was her lullabies that soothed him into peaceful sleep. At first, the other staff whispered about it. "The maid is too attached," some said. "She forgets her place." But those whispers never lasted long, because the truth was obvious. The baby adored her. Even Mr. Williams, who was often busy with business, noticed one evening when he tried to hold his son. The child squirmed and fussed, until Grace walked in. The moment he saw her, his cries turned to laughter. Mr. Williams raised an eyebrow and chuckled. "Seems my son has chosen his favorite." Grace blushed, bowing her head respectfully. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't mean to." But Mrs. Williams interrupted with a smile. "Don't apologize, Grace. We are grateful. Truly." That simple acceptance lifted a burden from Grace's shoulders. For the first time since Daniel's death, she allowed herself to love freely again, without fear of being punished for it. She began to pour her heart into the baby, not as a replacement for her son, but as a way to honor him. She whispered Daniel's name in her prayers, asking God to bless the little boy she now cared for. But the change didn't stop there. Mrs. Williams herself was deeply moved by Grace's story. Her husband was wealthy, yes, but she realized that their wealth came with responsibility. She couldn't erase Grace's past pain, but she could help other mothers who were still living in that same nightmare. Quietly at first, she began to fund small programs that supported poor families in the city. She donated to hospitals, insisting that no child should ever be turned away because of money. She set up a foundation to provide emergency medical care for children whose parents couldn't afford it. And when people asked her why, she simply said, "Because no mother should lose a child for being poor." Though Mrs. Williams never revealed the full truth, Grace knew in her heart that this change had been inspired by her story, and that knowledge gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. As the baby grew, so too did the bond between the two women. Grace was no longer just a maid. She was invited to family meals, included in celebrations, even given her own seat beside the family during the baby's christening. She was treated with dignity, with warmth, with respect. The baby, in turn, thrived. He grew into a bright, cheerful toddler whose laughter filled the mansion like music. He called Mrs. Williams Mama and Mr. Williams Papa. But when he saw Grace, his face lit up in a special way. He called her Mama Grace, a name that stuck, much to everyone's delight. Every time he said it, Grace's heart swelled with both joy and bittersweet sorrow. She knew Daniel would never call her name again, never run into her arms again, but in some mysterious, tender way, she felt as though Daniel lived on through this child's laughter. It wasn't the same, but it was enough to keep her heart alive. One evening, as Grace rocked the boy to sleep, Mrs. Williams entered quietly. She sat beside her, watching the little one drift off, his breathing soft and steady. After a long silence, Mrs. Williams whispered, "You know, Grace, I used to think you worked for me, but I realize now we both work for him. He is our world, yours and mine, and I thank God every day that you are here with us." Grace turned to her, her eyes glistening. For years, she had carried guilt, pain, and loneliness. But in that moment, she realized something profound. She hadn't just found another child to love. She had found a family. Her tears fell silently, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of healing. Tears that whispered, "I am not alone anymore." And as she kissed the sleeping boy's forehead, she whispered a prayer into the quiet room. "Rest in peace, my Daniel. Your love is still alive in me, and I promise you I will never stop giving it." In the grand Williams mansion, amid all the wealth and power, the most valuable treasure of all was not gold, not diamonds, not business empires. It was love, pure, unshakable love, carried by a maid who had lost everything, yet still found the strength to give again. And that love, uniting two women from different worlds and a child who bound them together, became the bond that would never be broken.